So we'll quickly move on to our next session. We have Dr. Virmani, who is going to give his keynote address. But I would just like to give a quick introduction for Mr. Virmani. In fact, Dr. Virmani is the member at Niti Aayog. So if you know, like Niti Aayog is the Prime Minister's think tank, which was actually re-christened from Planning Commission to Niti Aayog and has a different mandate now. He was also the chairman of the EGROW Foundation. He's also been the executive director at IMF and also the chief economic advisor to the government of India, if I remember it correctly. Yes, so Dr. Virmani, it's just an absolute honor for having you with us, and look forward to your views, please. Over to you.
So this title was actually suggested by my wife and son. I told them I'm going to give an academic talk. It's a macro academic talk, but they thought that it should have a sexy title. So it's kind of a contradiction here, but it's not really. So let me, and also, my perspective is a macro perspective. You've heard a lot of details over the last day and a half. Some of these concepts really are very academic, and I've tried to make them simple, actually, so oversimplified. But nevertheless, and I'm going to, given the shortage of time, I won't have a chance to give you all the nice examples which I have, the stories. So forgive me for that, but maybe we'll have later, I think in the last session, some chance of having questions. So this is a macro perspective, and actually I should mention, for those of you who are academically inclined, it's based on a paper from where I was before I joined the government. It's called India Vision 2050. There's 3 years of thought. I also want to mention, for those of you who are academically inclined, in 2000, I wrote this monograph, which has 50 pages of policy reform, and which 70 to 80% of it has been done. So what I'm looking for, the opportunity that Prime Minister has given, I'm looking to create this next book. I don't think it's going to happen. I'm running out of time. But okay, so behind this is really a lot of detail which I won't be able to present. So that's just a warning. So let's start. According to what I'm going to show you is how India is going to become a high-income country by the mid-century. It was a lower middle-income country at the turn of the century. Before 2035, it will be what is called an upper middle-income country. These are all World Bank definitions, and a high-income country by around the turn of the middle of the century. So a little bit, I'll talk about public welfare, which is intimately connected with per capita GDP at PPP. For example, our focus for the last 75 years has been on eliminating poverty, which in our estimation, I have two co-authors. We last year published a paper, which is an IMF staff paper, that absolute poverty, as we have been talking about it for 75 years, has been virtually eliminated. What we proposed was another measure which is more relevant to a middle-income country, which we are now, where we have roughly 18% poverty rate. This also will be eliminated by 2035 when we become an upper middle-income country. The second part, I give you some numbers on the economic size and power. You've all heard that India is now the 5th largest economy. Again, in the next 5 years, we'll become the 3rd largest, but we will really become number 3, which will be the closing of the gap with China, which I'll show you some numbers. My conservative projections, I make very conservative projections, though yesterday I gave a similar talk, a summary of it. And the gentleman insisted I was very optimistic, but of course you heard John Chambers, who has 2% higher than my projection. So I'm safe. I don't think I'm over-optimistic. And I'll give you something about the key means of achieving the objective and the drivers of growth. So let's start in the conventional way, which business schools like to do. What are the threats and opportunities? And basically, there are opportunities, there are threats which we can turn into opportunities, and weaknesses which must be turned into opportunities. This, in a very simple way, is the overall macro framework which will get us to the place which I talked about. So what are the opportunities? Global and Indian demography. So the relative changes in India versus the developed countries will create certain opportunities for India in the world and for the world, basically talking about the developed countries, which is the US, EU, Japan, etc., to invest in and benefit from India's growth. And the second one, which you may have heard a lot about, but I think it's even more critical than anybody, including our government right now, which is pushing this a lot, the supply chain diversification, which is going to happen over the next 10, 15 years. The threats, oil and energy prices has always been a threat to the government. I have dealt with, in my career in government, I have dealt with 3 crises, starting from the 91 oil crisis and every subsequent oil crisis. And having dealt with them, I wrote a paper which showed how bad every such crisis is for India. So that's a threat which is always there, but we are converting it into an opportunity. I don't know whether you heard about solar power. This Prime Minister did that, took it much further. Of course, we have talked about it for a long time, but it's actually becoming a reality. The second one is, again, unmentionable. Everybody knows the country, the threat emanating in the Indo-Pacific. I'm sure all of you have heard the word Indo-Pacific, and you know what that threat is. But for us, it's actually convertible into an opportunity, and that is by creating a private public defense industrial complex, which is going to be a huge opportunity for Indian firms and for US firms, actually. The weakness, again, you know all of it, is the level of education and job skills. And here is some important points I'm going to make, which again appear, but again, the significance is not realized. The low female labor participation rate you all heard of, and the big force here is going to be work from home, in my view. And finally, the old structural employment trap, which some of you in here may not know so well, but the fact that 50% of Indians are still employed in agriculture, 2/3 of the population is still in rural areas. So that's a kind of a trap which we have to get out of, and that will happen, in my view, will have to happen if we are to achieve what I'm saying. Okay, so what are the key pillars? As I said, I've tried to make it simple, not make it too academic. So these are sustained, fast, inclusive growth. The numbers I assume are summarized here. Per capita GDP growth of 5.8% per year, which translate into 6.4% GDP growth, because the average population growth is going to be about 0.6% a year during this period. There are many other forecasts. When I presented this, a similar talk at the Indian Economic Association, the only question I got on this was that, why are you assuming it so low? You know, everybody's talking about 7.5. Of course, Chambers is out there, outlier, but a lot of people talking. My reasoning is that I prefer to be cautious, and having been in planning, I have found that overestimation of growth actually leads to a lot of wasteful expenditures. That's the primary reason I hate making optimistic projections, because they always translate into excessive expenditures and waste, because you assume revenues will be much higher. So the sustained fast growth, the equality of opportunity, women, SC, ST, you've heard some of it before, but that's it. and the digital revolution. Again, you heard a lot about digital revolution, but I'm going to focus on one particular part of it, which is critical to the scenario which I'm outlining here. So the basic macroeconomic idea here is a virtuous cycle with equality of opportunity driving growth, fast growth driving equality of opportunity, and a digital transformation which will drive both of them, and to get inclusive growth. So here are the numbers. The next 3 slides give you a little bit of the idea of where we are going, and then we'll get into the details of how it's going to happen. So underlying my projections is, I've done projections for the formal ones. I started publishing from 2004-05, and they are based on the economics of growth, catch-up growth it is. Some of you may have heard of it. And kind of the reforms which have already happened. I'll give you a little bit of idea of that. But there's a big misunderstanding which, from the discussions I've heard, I don't want to criticize anybody, but where we are coming from, and that's why I showed this book. It's downloadable. It's on the website. You can download this and see. People here just do not understand. The young don't understand. You can judge my age from that. Is how controlled our economy was in 1975. You just cannot imagine it in this country, And if you read this thing, you will find out what it is. There are hundreds of controls in this little book here, 80% of which we have removed, but lots still remain, okay? So what is it? India's per capita GDP, if you look at that graph, that is, it'll go from about 40% of world average, that's the purple line there, to 130%. So we are very poor relative to the average of the world, 40%. But we will go to 130% by the time I've outlined. And this is also important for the US people to understand. We will go from 1/10 of US per capita income to 1/3. We'll still be far, far behind the American standard of living. That's the important thing. And it's important because we talk about all the good things, but we sometimes forget, compared to the US, there are still a huge amount of poor people in India. And I'm saying this particularly for an American audience. Of course, many of you of Indian origin, you may know, but it's very important in discussions of Indo-US relations, economic relations. Just a few numbers here. Don't worry about the table, just look at the right side. So this is what, despite becoming a high-income country, we will just go from being 127th ranked currently in per capita PPP terms to 90th. We'll still be far away from the US. That is the same point, and many other countries, 89, again, this is a rough number because I have not forecast all the other countries, but it's a rough indicator of the rank of our per capita GDP. The last two statements on the right are in terms of India-China. Currently, our GDP in PPP is 41%. It'll double to 80%. So part of the important thing is going to be the catch-up with China. So the gap is going to close, but it's not going to close 100%, even in 2050. And VIPP is an index which I defined in 2004-05, and the importance of it you'll see in the next line here. Okay, so the purple line here is this is all India relative to China. I think it's very important to have this in mind because this is going to be part of what is driving India-US cooperation in the next 10-15 years. The big jumps in Indo-US cooperation you've seen are going to be driven even further because of the challenge from China. So what is it? India's GDP, per capita GDP will rise only from 42% of China's to 65%. So even relative to China, in these conservative projections, we are not going to catch up. the green, that's the purple line. The green line here is the normal thing people look at, which is the current US dollar ratio. But the important point I want to make here is the red line, which is my index of economic power. And you'll see that the green line is touching the red line at the bottom. And if you look to the right, the gap between the PPP and this index is closing. That is what happens when the difference between the PPP measure and the US dollar measure is highest for poorer countries. So as we catch up with the West, with the US, and now with China, that gap closes. So the red line actually is a better measure of power. And you can see it's roughly equal to the dollar relative value. So that's a reasonable measure which we commonly look at, the ratio of the dollar values. And as it says in the last line, that's going to go from 0.27 to 0.62 of China. But that is a level for those who are interested in national security. Russia's power at its peak was about 40% of the US. So being at 60% will make us clearly the third most important power in the world. Okay, I should probably have to speed up a bit here. Yeah. So a lot of talk about, the one big things, the revolution of reform you may have read of, the 1901 reform. The driver for it was redefining the role of government. As I indicated to you, in the 50s and 60s, we were very socialist oriented and very badly in a sense of trying to control everything without being a communist country. So in some sense, we got the worst of both worlds. And so part of the effort has been over these years of reform from 91 is to redefine the role of government and the private sector. And very simply, the government, the idea, the economic idea behind it is very clear. It is what is called public good provision and regulation of externalities. There's been a lot of talk about regulation. In the economics of growth, regulation, there's a theory which is called externalities. And so basically regulations are designed, or should be designed, to take care of these externalities. This is not something we do arbitrarily. There's a theory behind it, which one studied at Harvard. My thesis advisor was Kenneth Arrow. You may have heard of him. So this is not something we are discovering today, but the political system is discovering this today. That is where the good things which many of you have talked about is happening. So we are clear, the public good provision must be done by government. The market environment, which some of you talked about earlier in the day, has to be created by the government. That is the role of the government. The macroeconomic environment must be correct. Then it is up to the private sector to compete, innovate, and invest. In that sense, you are very right. The way we have been judging is, do regulations promote competition or they obstruct it? That's absolutely the key word which I have been trying to convey to our people for the last 30 years. That's really the only test which can be applied, and you very correctly say it's a very hard job to do that and to make people understand. So the social sector, I won't have time for that, but I want to come back to the global comparative advantage, the relative demographics. What it shows you is that India as an economy is going to go from comparative advantage in unskilled labor to semi-skilled labor to skilled labor. Now, you may say we are doing all these things right now. Yes, but it's small parts of the population. I am talking about the average. I'm talking about 1.4 billion people, or 1.6. So the average comparative advantage is going to shift like that because of the international demographics and the skills which we will have to develop. Here I just want to mention, I'm very worried in India of this word AI because 90% of the people who use it don't understand it. So the way I like to talk about it, just to make a point, because it's the same thing actually, is in terms of expert systems versus robotics. Robotics is completely wrong for India. It's expert systems which will help us leverage the unskilled labor and the semi-skilled labor, because whatever you do, the high-skilled labor anywhere in the world cannot be beyond a certain proportion, maybe 10%, 15% of the population. What about the rest? Okay, and this is one of the important points I want to make. So, which I'll come back to. So, reforms undertaken very briefly. The Bankruptcy Act is a major move. People don't realize, myself and many of those who I worked with have been trying to get the bankruptcy code for 10, 15 years. And it almost happened in 2013. We had a new corporate law, company law. It was put there, then it was removed for political reasons. That is why the credit has to go to the Modi government who actually did it. You know, it's very easy. I mean, I may have mentioned it in this book in 2000, it doesn't matter, right? Eventually, the person who gets the credit, should get the credit, is one who does it, okay? And they did it. I think it's very important to recognize that. It doesn't matter what the origins were. I'll tell you another example a bit later. Monetary Policy Committee, the constitutional amendment of GST. People don't realize this is the first major amendment of the Constitution on economic law, the first one in 70-year history. People say the BJP opposed it when they were in opposition. Maybe, yeah, perhaps. But this required a huge effort. It's the first constitutional amendment for economics. There have been all kinds of other political and other things. DBT, you already heard of. If you don't mind a nod to myself, I developed the concept of the UID in 2006. I started with at 2002. It's called the Unique ID Number. I took it through all the conceptual stage. We got the Planning Commission to appoint a committee, and we worked out the exact details of the UID. We had a cabinet note ready. That is what became the Aadhaar. But the difference was there was so much opposition that I focused it only on the welfare part of it. What the first chairman, Nilekani, did was, by that time he was lucky, Modi was there. Again, sorry to mention the name, I don't like to get into politics, but I'm talking economics here. Nilekani realized that he can now push it because Mr. Modi will not care. I had to meet the leftist opposition because I was doing it in the Congress government against the opposition of the communists and leftists. So I discreetly dropped, or didn't mention, we had one line. But what, Nilekani, with the help of Mr. Modi, I mean, it's again, who deserves the credit? Not me, not Nilekani, it's Mr. Modi, because he just pushed it. Okay, so it's important to give the credit, it doesn't distract for it. I have dealt with 5 prime ministers, okay? The person who actually does it deserves the credit. You can keep talking about it. It doesn't make any difference. Okay, so corporate tax, natural resources, auctions. I'm sorry, I'm giving economic lectures, but the thing about natural resources is you don't know the value, okay? And the only way to determine, because each is kind of unique, okay? So the only way to determine value is through an auction, because it's anybody's guess. So the guy who's actually going to pay you, he will be careful in defining what he thinks is the value and give you the money. So auctions, another big reform. I've struggled from personal knowledge, I can tell you, and it's here. I struggled to do coal auctions, telecom here, the law minister of the Congress party was here in one of these buildings. And I tried to persuade him, introduce telecom auctions. He nodded, he's understood, very, very bright lawyer. Went back, couldn't do it. Okay, so again, telecom auctions were introduced in the Vajpayee government. They deserve full credit for it. Okay, very important move. Corporate tax, bold, very bold again. I'm sorry to spend, I hope Amit will not mind, because there are lots of stories behind each of these things. And this is the most interesting one, actually. After the 2019 budget, I gave up on this government. I said they are not going to do any more reforms. And then in September 29, this corporate tax reform, which was beyond anything I had recommended. Basically, when you're recommending something which you know everybody opposes, one is cautious. That's my experience. When I recommended reform of the foreign exchange system, I went very cautiously. I did like phase 1, phase 2, 3. But, this was very bold. I mean, for so long you don't do it, and then suddenly it's way beyond my expectation. So that's what convinced me, and you can see I'm back in government. So government monopoly, strategic industries, labor codes. Again, a story behind it. It's interesting. I'm sorry, as I told Amit, because stories are always more interesting than hard facts. So labor codes, 44 or so labor laws put into 4 codes 2-3 years ago. And then I'm sitting outside 3 months ago and wondering what has happened. So the moment I became a member of NITI, I asked for a review. It happens to kind of be under my charge, so to say. And we understood that 28, there's a law is enacted by the central government. It's on the concurrent list. In the concurrent list, all the states have to make the rules. Otherwise, the law cannot be implemented. So in this time, 28 out of 13 states had given the rules to us. Now, why is that so important? Because people keep talking about dictatorships. It's absolute nonsense. We follow the Constitution. We have to. If we were a dictator of any kind, you could just announce and promulgated the laws. That's not how it's done in India. If it's on the concurrent list, the states have to make the rules. It doesn't work otherwise, and we follow the Constitution. Okay, education policy. Let's move on. Okay, there are 2 or 3 other big points. One I've already told you, the competitive markets is a driver. That's a very important point you made. Institutional reforms, there's a whole bunch of stuff happening. Social reform, I'll kind of just go over it. And supply chain diversification. That's the, where are we now? Oh, sorry. Yeah, the growth environment and the supply chain. So I just want to mention there is institutional reform and social there. Whenever we have a chance, we don't have the time now. But supply chain, I mentioned, is a big thing, and I just want to make a few points. I think there's going to be high-tech decoupling between, you could call it a loosely led American bloc. India will be part of it, but we'll also be more flexible. That's going to be inevitable. If we are going to be number 3, we are not going to be, clearly inclination-wise, we are part of a US order, but we will not be part of an any order in that sense that we will have an independent voice and role. Partial economic decoupling, basically more trade within the 2 entities, less across. Partial, by its very nature, partial means it's not going to be totally separate. The high-tech will be, but the economic order will not be. This is my view. By the way, these are my views, not necessarily those of the government, though there may be a certain amount of overlap. And here the point is very important. Why is this happening? Because the PRC has a monopoly of 4 major sectors. You see those numbers there. EDP and office equipment, 40% of the world's exports come from the PRC. Telecom, 39%. Clothing, 32%. Textiles, 47%. I've never seen this kind of monopoly in the world before. It's a real monopoly. You think of domestic monopolies, 3 firm, 4 firm, but this is amazing. Nobody has bothered. This cannot be good for anybody. You're totally dependent. So this diversification has to happen. It will happen. Okay? So that is that's the big drivers of growth. That's going to be the driver of growth, and India will benefit for it, and US will cooperate with India, and there'll be mutual benefit. That is the thing which I would appeal to all of you to think about and promote. We can benefit mutually from this diversification which is going to happen. Okay, equality of opportunities. Here I want to mention, because a lot has been talked about health. And there is a fundamental difference from my perspective between what I call private health and public health. It's not a question of delivery. Delivery can be private or public, but there is a concept of public health in the economic literature. I warned you, I'm going to give a few economic lectures here, but this is very basic. So the public health is, again, that externality word, public goods, partial public good, externality. These concepts are there in economics. We stopped applying them, even in India, by the way. I'm not saying only in the US. We've stopped applying them. It's all there. It's different. Government has to be involved in public health. There's never been an issue in my mind, but the theory tells me, everything tells me. So that I just want to emphasize that, okay? Employment is very complicated. I have a list. I made a list yesterday. I made it again because this is a question I always get. It's a very complicated issue, but it basically has to do with bad policies over 75 years. We have started removing them. One of them I just mentioned, labor code, which is still not implemented. It's done, but it's still to be implemented. One thing we have completed is something called SSI reservation, which we had for 50 years. But that's just been removed about 15, 20 years ago. And there's a whole bunch of other stuff. Knowledge economy. Now, the basic point, there are 2 points I want to make here. One is the critical need to get the right information to the right people at the right time. Now, why, you would say, is this government is a nanny state? No. Again, the economics of information is there. It tells us there are large externalities in the flow of information. Information has the problem of asymmetry. So if I don't know anything about treating my own health, I will never search for it because I have no idea. So there are 3 levels. You all talk about the high level. There is a low level for less educated people. There's a middle skill level. And then, of course, the higher one, which you all discussed and you all know about. And that's why I like that presentation you made. It fits with this concept here. And I'm always looking for information to fill this thing out, because this, I think, is going to be critical for the future. Okay, I'm kind of going to skip over that and go into detail if somebody wants, and we'll have time. But I want to come to another the digital infrastructure you heard about, but I want to give you a different way of looking at it, okay? So, of course, it's pioneering, third way. You heard people earlier. But for me, there are 2 things. Actually, given the time constraint, are we running out, Amit? Okay, let me, so there is an approach which doesn't matter, but the second one is more important, which I want to. So here is the problem which I want to address with this, and I think it's absolutely critical. We have a scalability problem. So India's population is twice that of USA and EU combined. You cannot imagine the scale of that problem, and I'll give you one example of the scale. About 15 years ago, I don't remember the exact, Apollo Hospital, one of the first private hospitals in Delhi, came up. I visited that. It was exactly like I had been to a US hospital when I worked here at the IMF. Spotlessly clean, 2 or 3 people are waiting, or going somewhere, few nurses going forward, back, there's a doctor running from his office to somewhere. Deserted. I went there 5 years ago. What did it look like? It reminded me of the time I used to travel on the railways. Scalability. The moment you build something, it gets full. So the scalability problem is what will the digital, my whole concept is, and it's not coming out of the blue. In 2006, the then deputy chairman of the Planning Commission said that the political system is asking me what should we do with government services, which meant health, education, etc. And I studied this whole problem, and I came to the conclusion there's no other way. It has to be telemedicine, education, and fintech we've already got, and you've heard of it. But because people are not thinking enough of this, of course, you have a lot of examples, and I'd love to talk to anybody who has ideas on these things. So that's one aspect, but there are other aspects. Local hierarchies. There was mentioned doctors don't want to go there. I've seen this problem for 50 years, madam. It doesn't work. We've tried everything. We've tried to have compulsory one-year courses. My wife is a doctor. She had to forced to go out in the rural areas. She's not going to stay there. And nobody does. You can't do it. We've tried it. Only way is telemedicine. Okay? I think I made my point. Let me try to finish. Okay, one more, sorry. The last point here, the female labor force participation, I think what is going to be critical. Again, this is something which I am pushing, which I believe, after having studied this thing, that there's no other way. Again, the work from home. So rural women, they have tough time getting out of the house and going to a job, maybe a few miles away in the local little town or whatever. But they can work from home now. Not everybody, not the whole mass of population, but a lot of educated women could do that. Okay? So work from home is going to be another revolution in my view. And of course, the private sector can make it happen, actually. And again, any ideas are welcome. Okay. That's it. I'm going to, so Green India is another thing. I just put it on the table, but this is going to be a driver. The digital is here. It's going to drive for the next 10, 15 years. Green India will come later. There's a whole bunch of new ideas we have. The PM has, they are listed here, but I'm sure you will hear about it in the next many years and may have heard already. So what is it? Okay. So here we are. This is the finishing overview. So in my view, by mid-century, there is going to be a tripolar world with what I call a multipolar rim. So US, China, India will clearly be the big powers. 2 days ago or something, I saw a projection by some consultancy which goes to 2075. You don't have to go to 2075, but he was trying, I think, to see how much Indonesia would come up. So by that time, actually, they showed 3 big pillars and Indonesia down here, the next one, 4th. So just gives you a picture. That's all I'm trying to give you. RIM, Japan, Germany, UK, France, Russia will all be part of the RIM by that time, even 2050. India's economic power, I already told you the VIPP of 0.83. We're still far from the top. We will be clearly number 3, in my view. There are people who imagine in India that we'll somehow beat China. No, it's not going to happen that quickly. Globally, military, again, I come back to that. This is not just a military opportunity. It's an industrial opportunity, which if you can convey to, there are a lot of entrepreneurs here. I would like to tell them there's a huge opportunity for India, US, in the military industrial field. The decoupling I've already mentioned. Okay, final. So India, a high-income country, average quality of life will be kind of like the EU of the 1995, still a long way to go. Sustained fast growth we've talked about. The paradox of power. This is the difference from the US. China and India are different because they are large countries. We will have 4 times the population of the US. So even though power rank will be 3, income rank will still be 90. That's a very important point to remember. Why is it important? Because in things like FTA negotiations, economic relations, you have to remember there will still be a large part of India's population which compared to the US will still be poor. By US definition of poverty, it will still be huge. So in some sense, at least for the next 15 years, 20 years, US has got to give India a leeway as far as extraction of advantage is concerned. That's the point here. Okay? It's not that we'll be permanently exempted from anything. Of course, there's a question of mutual benefit, but this issue should not be completely forgotten. Let me end with that. Thank you.
I'll ask my question on the framing of the healthcare workforce that you talked about. Dr. Virmani. You said a few slides into your talk how there is an upskilling needed, and then India is going to traverse that path from low skill to medium skill to high skill. And then when you came to the healthcare portion, you said telemedicine will be needed because we can't get doctors in rural areas, and that's hard. So I'm combining those two. And I'm combining those two to ask this question. Is there a need for skill levels at all three of those buckets? And is there employment opportunity, which is a hard question to answer, I know. Employment opportunity in healthcare, using healthcare as an example, at all three of those buckets, where we are upskilling, but also skill enhancing through technology.
Absolutely. So that slide, which I kind of rushed over because I had asked for 45 minutes with Amit, he reduced it to 35. It's okay.
I'm sorry for that.
He's done that to everybody.
Yeah. So that's exactly the point that while we focus on the higher levels, we mustn't forget the middle particularly. And the lower is something we have to do, but the middle is where you all can still help. Because of the telemedicine, thing, there's a huge amount of work to be done, and profits to be made. I mean, reasonable profits, not huge. Let me give you two brief examples. One is, of course, the case of I had a friend whose daughter had an accident, motorcycle, and she became disabled. He needed a speech therapist and a physical therapist. He couldn't find one in India. So he had to come to the US, get a job here, and live here. That's the kind of gap that exists. We still do. When I last worked on it, we set up the Skill Development Corporation. I was involved in that. We identified 5,000 to 6,000 middle skills. That's why I emphasize the middle. Okay, they're there. We need the skills. When people talk about employment, you can't have employment without skills. So there is a large construction company I don't want to name because the board member told me. He said this construction company has 150,000 job openings for construction workers. They cannot find them. Now, somebody asked me when I said this, they said, you mean plumbers? Well, plumbers, but you know what? This is a industrial project company. Plumbers are not the plumbers you are thinking of. They make huge chemical pipes, right? Those are also plumbers. We call them fitters, by the way. So yes, you need trained people to build huge projects. They are plumbers, okay? There may be an electrician, but the electrician who comes to my house is different from the electrician who's going to wire up a big factory or an electronics company. So I think I've answered your question. Yeah, right.
Another one? Yes, please.
So Dr. Virmani, as the most passionate economics talk I've heard, so thank you so much for that. My question is the growth rate, sustained growth rates that you mentioned, you're saying it's conservative at 5.8%, and there are estimates going up to 7% or even exceeding that. So what are the reforms that the government can look at if we were to get from 5.8 to 7%? Or is it are externalities imposing which can limit the growth to 5.8?
So part of this cutting down of thing, I had a whole slide on, I've given 8 reforms on that. Let me mention just a couple of them. There's large numbers left, okay? Sorry, this gentleman, you're raising your hand for something else. Okay. The one which I have personally been involved with are the tax reform. So let me mention 3 things. It's all 3. The corporate tax has been done. The direct tax code has not been promulgated. This is something which I was my last, virtually the last week as chief economic advisor in 2009. We had approved a direct tax code, a completely new code, okay, which gets rid of the 1965 law, and before that, I don't know, colonial, who was, gentleman quite rightly mentioned colonial heritage. Yeah, right. So that law is still there from, So we had formulated a direct tax code which is modern and looks at all the economics, the new economics, the best practices. Anyway, so like that, customs duty. You look at GST. GST, as I said, is the most important constitutional reform But as part of that reform, a lot of compromises had to be made because all the states have to approve it. Okay? We have a constitution, and you have to follow the constitution. You have to get the approval of a majority of states. You can't just sit there and do it, you know? Again, people think, talk about dictatorship as if, we are some, we have a constitution, we follow it. Everybody follows that constitution, including the judiciary, yeah. So there are a whole bunch of reforms which are there listed. If you, I told you this paper, you download this paper, it's all here.
Yes, so there is a question in the back, the person with the mic.
Can you hear me? So you spoke about the monopoly in manufacturing. India has to play a very important role. So that definitely demands that we got to build a lot of infrastructure and manufacturing units. But at the same time, 20% of the world's GHG emissions comes from manufacturing. So if you put green focus a little later and focus on manufacturing, how will that work? And then at the same time, unfortunately, because of our population, will be the most impacted nations for the climate. So what's your view on that?
So firstly, what I'm talking about manufacturing is the shift in supply chains which is going to happen, okay? It's not, I'm predicting. You can, if I'm still alive 5 years from now, you can call me here and pillory me if it doesn't happen. So that is going to happen, and India recognizes it. For example, we are doing FTAs with your EU, UK. We've already done one with Australia. Those are very important. And let me tell you why. Vietnam, when I looked at it 5 years ago, all their infrastructure, you talk about infrastructure, all their infrastructure indices were worse than India's, the standard World Bank indicators, okay? So why are they doing so well in electronics? One important reason which nobody talks about, they have a FTA with EU which gives them a 12.5% advantage over India straight away. Okay? So the issue is way beyond infrastructure. If you look at the infrastructure, that's a good question. But by the way, I'm on Twitter, and I saw this news on Twitter, so let me advertise. Those of you who want to follow me, I still tweet at DRA Virmani, okay? But I saw this, the Singapore ambassador to India. He went to the Mumbai-Delhi Expressway, and he posted 4 pictures, okay? And he was delighted. He was jumping. He literally, in the 4th picture, he's on the highway dancing, indicating he's so impressed, okay? I mean, literally. I can find the picture and show you. I mean, it was quite amazing. I mean, surprised, that's why. I am surprised, that's why I'm saying it. So, infrastructure has improved tremendously, okay? It started with the Vajpayee government. They made a big move and tremendous progress under this government. Again, that's one of their actually signature achievements. We talk only about digital, but so what about climate, and what about the forecast? I did not say the green is not important. Now again, this is a time problem. I mean, if we can put that back, let me show you how much we are innovating. It's just wrong. What you're concluding is wrong. I'm sorry. We are doing innovation. There are 4 things mentioned there which are not there in any other part of the government. We are talking about a change in lifestyles. We are talking about other things. This is not just talk. This is PM saying, do it. Of course, we may not have the ideas how to do it, but that is our fault, not his. So that is not what I'm saying. What I am saying is how much it will drive the growth. Please distinguish, okay? When we are saying digital economy is still like 3% or whatever. I don't know, you guys know it better. It's not driving the overall growth. It's going to drive it in the 10, 15 years. The green part will become a driver of growth 15 years later. That's the point. Please do not confuse. The Prime Minister is very clear. He is going all out on hydrogen. As an economist, as somebody who's been in planning, I like to do project appraisal. He is saying, I'm willing to take a bet on it. So that's not the issue. It's not that we are not doing it, okay? I mean, as a cautious economist, I would say, let's do some cost-benefit analysis or something. He's saying, no, I don't need it. Let's just put some money in it, see if it flowers. If there are 10 ideas on green, we will do those, and some of those will work, some won't. Kind of like an entrepreneur.
So last two questions, please. Professor Paul Raj, and then we have a young student from Stanford, like sir, right? So.
Thank you, Dr. Virmani. Okay, terrific talk up. So thank you for your remarks, very enjoyable. I want to add one more tailwind for India, which I sometimes remark about, is that on the broad econ policy, there's also political consensus. Despite some sparring at the edges, broadly, whatever party is in power, I think this direction is going to remain, which I think is also bodes very well for India. Could you please remark?
Yeah, absolutely correct. So I was asked this question yesterday. So actually the question was, after Modi what? The standard type of question. So that's exactly what I said. One point was what exactly you have said. The direction is there. The direction has not changed since actually the mid-80s. 91 was the big one, which everybody knows about, but there were reforms in the 80s also, which actually accelerated the growth a lot. People don't realize. Again, it's in one of my papers. So what is the second one? See, the thing which will happen and has happened in the past is that a certain prime minister and a certain government may favor X, Y, Z more. The next person will say, okay, this is not that important, let's do ABC. So that will happen, okay? So the way I look at it, some people call it opportunistic. I said, whatever works with this government and this prime minister, let's do it. Then we'll see what happens in the next one. We'll see what their interests are and do the, that's a new challenge we'll address.
Last question for the day, please, for this session. Yes.
Hi, thank you so much for coming and engaging us. I just had to ask a question because you mentioned that Ken Arrow was your advisor, and I'm a big fan of his work. And Ken Arrow has a very famous article called "Are We Consuming Too Much?" that was written at Stanford. And it's in the context of that article that I really want to ask a question related to the earlier question about climate. Last year we had a historic heat wave in India. There were massive floods in Chennai and Bangalore. And I totally agree with you that India is a leader in terms of technology, implementing change. This is the West's fault. So I don't think it's an issue of is India not doing enough in terms of its share. But to me, these issues of, more than half of the Indian labor force are outdoor laborers, mostly farmers. And then more than half of GDP is cities, right? Which, whether you look at Bangalore or Delhi, are highly vulnerable, to these risks. So, my question, especially in the vein of Dr. Arrow's, famous paper, when you take these risks into account, does your story change? And are we underestimating the value of natural capital, particularly given your comment on, how do we value natural resources? It's the exchange value. So natural resources like water or forests are most important to the most low-income people whose ability to pay is the lowest. So our market value for those goods is very low, despite the fact that those are very important. So I just want to ask, taking into account all of these risks, does your story change?
Okay, there are two parts to it. First part I'll mention, I'm not one of the areas which I'm completely not an expert on is climate. Our new VC, Mr. Berry, is the man for climate and energy. So it's at a higher level than mine. So I won't be giving you an expert thing, but I do know macro, and I hate to do absolute projections, okay? I have always in my life done relative, and the basic assumption there is that any surprise, a global surprise, will affect everybody. It's highly dangerous. The only reason why I'm doing this because my prime minister likes absolute numbers. And I have to translate it into, otherwise I talk in numbers. The percentages I showed you, 0.83, 0.15, you'll never remember them. You only remember 3 trillion, 5 trillion, 10 trillion. But I did a compromise. I said, let's call it upper middle, and I never do that. So the basic assumption which I have is there are things which are not predictable, okay? We have to assume as a first cut that they'll affect everybody. And therefore, if I do relative projections, I'm taking account of all the things I know will happen, okay? I cannot take account of things which I cannot predict. Now, you can say there'll be a meteor which will strike the earth 20 years from now? I don't know. Yeah, maybe everything will change. Okay? I have no way of predicting it. Okay? Now, as far as climate change, your other part of the question, I wish we had that slide. I mean, there are huge numbers of initiatives. We are there, but I am not the expert, so I can't, I mean, I just have those things there. You can look at them, you know. We are not underplaying it. We are doing everything, including the part you're saying. There's a special mission. I remember a discussion the first time, I can give you a specific because there's nothing secret about it. The first month I came, there was a meeting of senior officers in the NITI that includes the VC members, CEO. And the presentation was on live, exactly the point you're making. That PM wants this, what are we going to do about it? Okay, so if you get the impression that the government or India is not concerned about it, that's absolutely wrong. Okay?
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Virmani. This has just been such a fascinating interaction. Thank you. And
Thank you.
as for your comment that after 5 years, I think we would love to have you again next year as well, 22nd, 23rd February next year. So it would be a pleasure to have you back here at that time and listen more.
If I may apologize, yes. I mean, what drives me, which is why I've taken this job, is because I still hope to, you know, despite my age, hope to do something.
Absolutely. We need people like you in the country, so thank you.